coming up on Chopper's Politics.
So if you're buying seed potatoes, well, that's a real problem because the seed potatoes may have British soil on it and you can't possibly bring that into Northern Ireland. I mean, it's a nonsense.
Hello, I'm Christopher Hope, the Telegraph's chief political correspondent, and this is Chopper's Politics. The UK vaccine rollout continues at pace. People in their 60s will soon be getting their first jab. But the last 7 days saw the vaccine narrative go down a very well-trodden path. Like many other stories in the past 5 years, it became a row about Britain's relationship with the European Union. It's been a case of I'll have what she's having, as the EU looks across to the UK's comparatively speedy rollout of coronavirus vaccine, as it deals with its own vaccine supply problems. So this week we look at when Brexit met COVID. I'll be catching up with former Tory Minister Theresa Villiers MP, who's part of a new task force looking at how the government can take advantage of new regulatory freedoms in order to kickstart the economy after the pandemic. And I'll be chatting to Sir Peter Westmacott, Britain's former ambassador to the US, about what he makes of the displays of diplomacy we've seen over the past few weeks. But first, back to Northern Ireland and its First Minister Arlene Foster, my first guest this week. I started by asking Arlene Foster when she first heard about the plans by the European Commission to impose a hard border on the island of Ireland to stop any vaccines getting into the UK.
Well, the very strange thing, Chris, was, and it's good to chat to you, was that I was actually speaking to one of the haulage firms in my own constituency about the grave difficulties that they were having about getting goods through. And then I get a text from my own office to tell me that EU have triggered Article 16 of the protocol. And I just couldn't quite believe it, to be honest with you. Because, of course, the protocol is a very complicated document. Article 16 is to be triggered if there are difficulties in Northern Ireland of an economic or societal nature. So it was put there to protect the people of Northern Ireland. And here we had the European Union invoking it, not to deal with trade supplies into Northern Ireland, but actually anticipating that there would be difficulties around vaccines moving from the Republic of Ireland through Northern Ireland into Great Britain. And it was quite shocking, to be honest.
What did you do about it? Did you get on the hotline to number 10? Did you call Dublin? Did someone call Washington? Or what did you do about it?
Well, I immediately texted the Prime Minister to ask him, first of all, was he aware, which I presumed he was, and secondly, to ask him what he was going to do about it, because we have been having grave trade difficulties here, not just trade, and no doubt we'll go through some of the issues between Great Britain and Northern Ireland since the protocol came into being on the 1st of January. And we've been saying to the Prime Minister that he needs to deal with those issues. He has said in the House of Commons that if necessary, he would trigger Article 16. But here we had the European Union triggering Article 16 for, as I say, anticipating problems around the supply of vaccine.
How do you reply? Did he say, we're aware of this, Arlene, or did he say...
No, we had a conversation after this. He was quite clearly shocked by the fact that the EU had taken this action. Of course, it had been trailed for some time, including in the Telegraph, that there had been difficulties with the European Union's vaccine programme, the fact that they had mismanaged the procurement of vaccine, and this was the outworkings of it. So, yes, he was quite shocked that they'd taken this action.
And of course, they backed down, didn't they, after a few hours, and we still didn't know why they did it.
I think it's interesting when you say, they revoked and they actually didn't go through with Article 16. If you look at the statement that they put through after all the political furore, they actually say in that statement that whilst they weren't invoking Article 16 at this point in time, they will consider using all instruments at their disposal. So to me, that says, well, we're not using it now, but we may use it in the future if we need to.
Yes, quite. So the threat is still there.
The threat's still there.
Just for our listeners, and do forgive me for asking this question, but can you explain what the Northern Ireland Protocol is, please?
In simple terms, the protocol was put in place by Boris Johnson and Leo Varadkar and then ratified by the European Union and, unfortunately, by our own Parliament after the general election. It was put in place ostensibly to make sure that there would be no hard border, i.e. infrastructure between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And in doing so, what has actually happened is that they have put restrictions between goods moving from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, effectively making the border between ourselves internally within the United Kingdom. And that's why so many, not just unionists, but people in Northern Ireland are so upset, angry, that actually within the United Kingdom now we have these barriers to trade.
I'm looking at a copy of the protocol here that was submitted to Parliament. It goes on for around, I think, 20 pages. On page 12, it talks about there were some limited processes on sanitary and phytosanitary movements into Northern Ireland, some which exist already today. And it did play down the impact on businesses, seeing goods flowing across the Irish Sea.
Well, certainly at the time, and we raised the fact that this was going to cause grave difficulties when this was put through Parliament, but we were told it's going to be fine. You'll just see maybe an increase in some of the checks around phytosanitary issues. And of course, we have had phytosanitary checks for many years because the island of Ireland is an epidemiology unit in terms of animal disease. So we've had that there in place. I don't think anybody was arguing around that. But what we've seen actually is a real and tangible increase, not just in checks around live animals and goods of animal origin, but around everything from parcels to pets to seeds coming in from Great Britain. This time of the year, Chris, a lot of people plant their gardens. They go on to somewhere like Sutton's and they want to order in their seeds. They can't do that anymore because they're told there's a risk. And of course, there's no risk. And I think the difficult thing for a lot of people in Northern Ireland to understand is why would the European Union see that as a risk? Being able to get plant seeds from Great Britain, how is that a risk to the single market of the European Union? So there is a lot of very grave anger in Northern Ireland about the way in which this protocol is rolling out, and we need to get it sorted, and we need to get it sorted immediately. If they're worried about plant disease, there was no plant disease in Great Britain before Brexit. So how are there any difficulties now post-Brexit in terms of Northern Ireland? I mean, one of the most offensive things I have to say for a lot of us here in Northern Ireland is that we're told that soil from Great Britain cannot make its way across the Irish Sea over to Northern Ireland. So if you're buying, for example, seed potatoes, well, that's a real problem because the seed potatoes may have British soil on it and you can't possibly bring that into Northern Ireland. Or if you're bringing a second-hand tractor or a second-hand digger across into Northern Ireland, you can't have any soil on it from Great Britain because that again will cause a risk to the single market. I mean, it's a nonsense. It's completely bizarre.
I'm going to have to pause you there, Arlene Foster. Are you saying that that GB and Northern Ireland are one country, but the soil cannot go between the two different islands? Is that correct?
That is correct. And that's why a lot of us find it so offensive when we're told that British soil cannot come into Northern Ireland.
And that was not the case before Brexit?
Oh, absolutely not. Of course not. I mean, obviously people were able to get their seed potatoes and they were able to order their plants and seeds for their gardens, but now they're not allowed to do that.
Who is stopping British soil going across the Irish Sea? Is it the European Union or is it the UK government?
Well, as you know, one of the difficulties for the UK government throughout, before Brexit was even thought about, was the fact that many of our officials here often looked at an EU directive and went to the nth degree to implement it, which of course was in stark comparison to our neighbours in the Republic of Ireland, who looked at a regulation and said, how can we get around this? We have a real difficulty with people in our system who have no imagination, who do not look at the reason behind the regulation, i.e., is it a risk to the European Union single market? And if it is not, then things should continue as normal. So I think it's our own government and our own officials looking at the regulations and implementing it to the nth degree. And that's one of the reasons why in a meeting with the Prime Minister tomorrow, I will be looking for answers in relation to all of these issues.
So it's gold plating by UK officials?
It is. I absolutely think it is gold plating. The EU, of course, as well, Chris, have never had a country leave their bloc. And I think that they are watching and looking on very carefully to see how things are being managed as well. So I think there is certainly more that the European Union could do to help Northern Ireland as well. I mean, for 4 years, those of us in Northern Ireland who are Brexiteers were absolutely lectured about the fact that the European Union wanted to protect Northern Ireland and protect the people of Northern Ireland. But we seen in one fell swoop on last Friday that actually that wasn't the case. And what they wanted to use the protocol for was actually to protect the European Union. So the mask has slipped, and I think that is very clear.
Would you believe with Julian Smith, the former Northern Ireland Secretary, that it was nearly a Trumpian act in what they did in Brussels?
Yes, and I think it was. There's been all of this commentary that it was a mistake and it shouldn't have happened. I don't think it was a mistake. I think it was premeditated. As I've already said, there was a lot of commentary in the national newspapers before this happened around the European Union and sabre-rattling about the fact that their vaccines needed to be got across to the European Union and protected. So therefore, to me, it was a premeditated act, one that was quickly, not totally reversed, but was stepped back from. But I think they used it to their own ends.
Are you demanding that the Northern Ireland Protocol is now changed, or just simply that British officials stop interpreting it so you can't even cross the Irish Sea with mud on your boots?
We have been working with the government to try and deal with some of the issues arising from the protocol, from even before the protocol came into being on the 1st of January. But I think there's a more fundamental issue now. I think the European Union have described it as a reset. We need to see far more than a reset. We need to see, based on where is the risk to the single market. To me, that's the fundamental issue. I understand the European Union wants to protect their own single market. And my goodness, we've seen some of their protectionism over this past few days. But you cannot do that to the economic and societal damage to the people of Northern Ireland who are still part of the United Kingdom. They're actually interfering in the affairs of a sovereign country. I could show you emails that I've had from people in Yorkshire, people in Scotland who are absolutely outraged. A man from Yorkshire said to me today on an email, we haven't actually achieved Brexit because part of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland, is still within the European Union.
That was done to avoid a hard border, wasn't it? So there's dual jurisdiction over Northern Ireland. That's why they did it.
I think it's very important that your listeners understand the Belfast Agreement was put in place with a number of relationships. First of all, you had the relationship internally in Northern Ireland between the different parties. You had the relationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, the so-called North-South axis. But importantly, you also had the East-West axis. And the East-West axis has now been damaged by the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I think that equilibrium, and we all know that Northern Ireland is a very balanced place, and to have that equilibrium, to have that balance, you cannot damage one of the key elements of the Belfast Agreement, and that is the East-West relationship. And unfortunately, the Northern Ireland Protocol does just that.
Do you think this undermines Northern Ireland being part of the UK? Are you worried that by doing this, the UK is almost giving away or risking the sovereignty of Northern Ireland?
For a lot of us who fundamentally believe in the union of the United Kingdom, and I've actually seen the strength of the union in the way in which we've dealt with COVID-19, not least the rollout of the vaccination programme, we're very upset, angry about the fact that our own government have put in place a protocol with the European Union, which actually separates us from Great Britain. Of course, the most important market for us in Northern Ireland is Great Britain. It's where we do the most of our trade. It's where we get the most of our trade from. And what this protocol does is damage all of that. And that's so fundamental that it goes actually back to the Act of Union back in 1800 that talks about the purpose of the Act of Union. And one of the purposes, of course, was trade, so that we could benefit from trade within the UK internal market. So this goes very much to the heart of what Northern Ireland is about. And the Prime Minister really does need to recognise that whilst well-meaning, whilst based on a bad and a skewed understanding of the Belfast Agreement, which I don't totally blame him for because that started back at the time of Theresa May, there needs to be a change to the protocol. There needs to be a change to everything that has happened. And he needs to recognise that very, very quickly, because I worry about the community tension here in Northern Ireland. I worry about the way in which people are so angry that our own Prime Minister has taken this action.
With that in mind, what do you make of these animal-based food checks at Larne and Belfast being suspended because of threats to staff?
Yeah, well, of course, it's reprehensible that anyone should be threatened going about their work. And, You know, it really is very, very concerning, and we're trying to get to the bottom of all of that while supporting the people who have been working at Larne and at Belfast, and we've had to take some action to do that today. But we need to get to the bottom of all of this. We need to change the protocol, and I think the Prime Minister needs to act really, really quickly now. Actually, the European Union have given him an opportunity, given their disgraceful behaviour last Friday. And I know that the Prime Minister cares about Northern Ireland. And because he does need to take action.
What changes would you want to be made to this protocol here, this 20-page protocol?
Well, what I'm saying to you is the protocol is meant to protect the single market of the European Union from any leakage between Great Britain and Northern Ireland making its way into the Republic of Ireland. There's very easy ways to do that. You take the supermarkets, for example, Chris. Supermarkets bring over many loads of goods every day into Northern Ireland. They're marked up in sterling, so there's no chance of them going into the Republic of Ireland because, of course, the Republic of Ireland works in euros. So why are those supermarkets subject to so many checks? Surely, given that we're in the UK single market, that should be good enough, the fact that they are marked up in sterling and they're going to supermarkets here in Northern Ireland. It's called the Trusted Trader Scheme. I don't understand why the European Union think that that wouldn't work between Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Apparently a lack of trust or something, I don't know.
Well, there may well be a lack of trust, but that works both ways. I think people need to understand that if there were any problems arising from that, yes, you could revisit it and see where the issues were, where the leakages were happening. But at the moment, the people who are suffering are the people who I represent in Northern Ireland, and therefore I have to raise their voice.
And just finally, Arlene Foster, what will happen next then? You're talking to Boris Johnson tomorrow. That's
yes.
a Zoom call, I imagine.
Yeah, yes, regrettably, indeed.
Regrettably.
What people here in Northern Ireland want to see is a clear commitment from the Prime Minister that, A, he understands where the difficulties lie. I mean, you will have heard the Prime Minister say there'll be no difficulty with goods coming from Great Britain into Northern Ireland. If there's paperwork, you should just rip it up. We all remember the speeches that he made. But unfortunately, that hasn't come to pass. And what we have actually are real and tangible barriers to trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And it's simply not good enough.
Arlene Foster, leader of the DUP, thank you for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, stay with us, listeners. Coming next, I'll be talking about how to make Brexit even better with Theresa Villiers right after this.
Hello, former England hooker Brian Moore here. Well, the Six Nations is back, and so is my podcast, Brian Moore's Full Contact. Each week we will get the biggest and best names from the world of rugby to dive into every ruck, maul and TMO decision. You can't nab a front row seat this year, but with our podcast you don't need to. So just search for Brian Moore's Full Contact on your podcast app, hit the subscribe button to make sure you don't miss it.
And we're back. Now, a year ago, I was just recovering from a massive hangover after Chopper's Brexit podcast lock-in in the Red Lion pub with around 50 of you lucky listeners who heard an audience including Nigel Farage, Mark Francois and Alison Pearson praise the opportunity of Brexit. Well, 1 year on, we're deep in the midst of a coronavirus pandemic, but the work on Brexit continues. And this week, Boris Johnson announced a new task force designed to look into how the government can capitalise on our newfound regulatory freedom to boost the economy after finally we emerge from lockdown. And one of those members of this new task force is Theresa Villiers, MP for Chipping Barnet and a former Tory cabinet minister and Brexiteer. So I gave her a call to find out more. Theresa Villiers, welcome back to Choppers Politics. Good morning.
Good morning, it's good to be here.
You've joined another committee. Now, you and I know about committees. Aren't they used to bury bad news?
There's a checkered history to initiatives like this, which are looking at regulation and regulatory reform. And there have been many committees that have looked at this and not necessarily made big changes. But we've got to hope that this time will be different. And one of the reasons why I hope it may be is that, of course, we have much greater freedom to take our own decisions on regulation now we've left the European Union. It is important that we use Brexit as an opportunity to do things better. We have some of the toughest regulatory standards in the world, and we need to maintain those, and we're very proud of them. But I think there is scope to find ways to deliver those tough outcomes in a more competitive, more up-to-date, more flexible way. And that, I think, is going to be an important part of ensuring that the decision to leave the European Union is a successful one when it comes to jobs growth and the economy.
That's right. It's called the Task Force for Innovation and Growth through Regulatory Reform. And I can't even think how that looks in letter form, which I know how they'll refer to it in the Cabinet Office. Big question from the left will be, will standards fall as a result of your work?
No, we believe that standards need to be maintained, but actually there are better ways to make sure that we protect those standards. I mean, not least looking at the way the regulation works to see whether it needs alteration to be more effective, more targeted. I think we also need a better system, perhaps, of reviewing regulation every few years to make sure that it's still doing the right job, that it's still delivering the right outcome, to see whether it's still needed.
Are you saying you want a new regulator of regulations?
Well, some people have suggested regulatory czars. It's something, no doubt, that will be looked at. I am conscious that, as I've said, this is a remarkably difficult thing to do because more or less every government, since the Roman Republic has talked about a better approach to regulation.
I think when you're in a cabinet, I recall the 1 in, 2 out rule. Do you remember that one, the George Osborne thing?
Yeah, and,
1 rule in, 2 out. I mean, did that even work?
I think they did make some real progress. I certainly had some sort of tough conversations with colleagues over how we did that. But the one thing, of course, that was a constraint there were great swathes of our regulatory rules which were totally off limits because they were EU rules. Now that constraint is gone, I think we can look afresh at some of our existing regulation to make sure it's working the right way. But also, I think an important part of what we do in this group is look at how we regulate in the future to make sure that any new rules are flexible, modern, targeted, and are smarter than some of the slightly clunky approaches that we've got from the European Union. The experience I bring to this group is I actually did spend 6 years in the European Parliament looking directly at regulation. And from that experience, I can be emphatic that the process of producing regulation is distinctly suboptimal because it is so difficult to build consensus across so many member states, so many interest groups. Different countries can have completely different kind of needs and priorities. And that can mean that at the end of the process, you end up with something which is more bureaucratic and heavy-handed than actually you need to maintain the high standard or outcome that you're seeking to protect.
So you're a poacher turned gamekeeper in old language. Do you have any easy targets you want to bring to the first meeting?
We're just getting started, so I don't think I would be talking about particular sort of specific targets at the moment. But I think it will be important, for example, to look at some of how our data rules are operating. In many ways, our data protection regulations perform important functions, and it's very important to make sure that people's data is protected. But it seems to me that there may be ways we can do it in a slightly less bureaucratic way than has been the case under GDPR.
And maybe around ports, there's a big debate about ports, isn't there? A lot of ports on the continent are owned or run by the state, whereas in this country they're privately owned, a lot of them, aren't they?
Yes, the infamous Ports Directive.
Yes.
It was opposed by the UK for many years precisely for that reason, because we had competition to regulate our ports, or at least most of them. Some are still trust ports, so sort of semi-state owned. I think that you're right. That's a classic example of a regulatory need in other EU member states to which the UK ends up being subjected to when it wasn't necessary. So that is something that it's worthwhile to look at.
Yeah.
And the Clinical Trials Directive also has attracted lots of controversy over the years, and certainly, looking at how we do better at ensuring that our pharmaceutical and world-leading medical companies are able to do the trials they need in an effective way, I think is also worth looking at. Biosciences and the sort of industries of the future is something which we will have a focus on in this group, because this kind of innovation and research is going to be key to having a successful economy in the future and recovering from the COVID outbreak.
That won't mean, medical trials will get people jumping around a bit, but that won't mean weakening the trials or making them less robust, will it?
Not at all. Not at all. The whole approach here is to maintain the most rigorous standards, but to deliver them in a way which is smarter, better, more modern, and actually just matches our domestic needs. Of course, events of the last 12 months demonstrates how crucial it is to maintain the highest standards in terms of efficacy and safety in trials of new medicines. But I think we've shown actually that we can take some good decisions in this country.
Yeah.
And we're doing very well in terms of development of vaccinations, delivery of vaccinations, and we compare very favourably with the record on this in the European Union. So I think looking carefully at how our processes of trialling and developing new medicines operate is an area worth looking at carefully. But as you say, safety will always be absolutely paramount.
I wonder if your task force might expose or perhaps blow open the Whitehall secret that actually often these rules and regulations by Brussels are gold-plated by our own people in the UK. We actually apply these rules far more rigorously than they do in the EU, and that's half the problem. We love following rules.
We are very diligent in our implementation of our obligations in the UK, and there's much to be said for that. Again, this is something that has caused there have been many initiatives over the years to try and address this issue. But I think we should, as a general principle, look to focus regulation on the basis of necessity and proportionality. You regulate only where it's necessary, and the measures you have need to be proportionate to the potential harm or problem that you're addressing. Those are simple principles, but sometimes they seem to have got lost in terms of regulation we already have on the statute book. And in terms of future regulation, I think they really need to be at the core of what we do.
And of course, Theresa Villiers, your review with Sir Ian Duncan-Smith and George Freeman, the former Life Sciences Minister, is due back on the PM's desk by the spring. But when can companies start to see the benefits?
As you say, we'll be reporting in the spring, and we hope we will have some good ideas that the Prime Minister consider implementing relatively quickly after that.
So you think it might be by the end of this year, we might see this calming down on the border? There might be some slimming down of these forms being filled in?
Well, I know that both in relation to the issues in Northern Ireland and the issues of exporting to the EU, there is intensive work underway by the UK government to try to fix the specific individual problems. We can't be certain of exactly when they'll be resolved. The point I make is that there are easements and flexibilities which are permissible within the EU's legal order that they could be offering us. And it's important that our ministers press for that to happen in order to resolve the really difficult problem that some businesses are undoubtedly having. I think what is important is to point to those obligations that the EU has in the free trade agreement they've agreed with us, that they won't use their so-called sanitary and phytosanitary rules on food as a means of protectionism. They would only use them in a way which is proportionate to the risk that their single market faces with food from the UK being imported into it. And the reality is the risks on that, were the same the day after the end of the transition period as they were the day before the end of the transition period. At the moment, they seem to be using an officious interpretation of the rules in order to to make life tougher for UK food exporters.
Well, Theresa Villiers, thank you for your time today. I should say that listeners to this podcast can email tigr@cabinetoffice.gov.uk any ideas for Theresa Villiers' task force to consider. Do mention Choppers Politics podcast when you email them. They might even try and listen in. Why not? Theresa Villiers, thanks once again for joining us today on Choppers Politics. Thank you.
Thank you. It was great to talk to you.
And since that interview, I've spotted that some places are referring to this new task force as Tiger, which certainly makes regulations sound far more thrilling than perhaps they deserve. Now, my next guest is Sir Peter Westmacott, one of the UK's most experienced diplomats, having been an ambassador for Turkey, France and the US. He's written a new memoir which comes out this week called They Call It Diplomacy, 40 Years of Representing Britain Abroad. And I caught up with him to discuss all things diplomacy, starting with the somewhat stormy events from last week. Sir Peter Westmacott, welcome to Choppers Politics. How are you?
Thank you very much. Delighted to be with you.
It's great to have you on, and you're one of the most experienced voices on the world of diplomacy we've got in this country. What did you make of last week's vaccine war that wasn't?
Well, it was a rather extraordinary business after all the toing and froing that we had had during the months beforehand. Given that this was such a difficult part of the withdrawal agreement to negotiate, it is extraordinary that they would immediately activate the part that they were very alarmed that the UK side might in some way activate and take action which would somehow recreate the border on the island of Ireland. So I think it's a very good question. I can only assume that it was a mistake when people in the Commission, under pressure from many member states who were saying, where are our vaccines? The Brits are light years ahead of us, and so are many other countries which did their own thing. And so they were looking at ways of somehow stopping vaccines made in the European Union coming to the United Kingdom. And then they said, it must be through that trapdoor, that back door in Northern Ireland. I think it wasn't thought through, and it was perfectly clear from a reaction of the Irish Prime Minister, of Michel Barnier, of other people in Brussels, that it was a mistake. And to their credit, I think people in Brussels admitted that they got it wrong.
I wonder if this might be a turning point in relations after 4 years of difficult negotiation over the Brexit, terms of Brexit, and then the actual trade deal. Do you think this might be the turning point at which we say that we are neighbours, we have to get on, we've got a shared border, it's like living in a terrace house having a party wall, you've got to get on with your neighbour?
I hope that it does, because, as you say, it was a very difficult period. An awful lot of Britain's foreign policy and international role was put on hold while we sorted out the consequences, if you like, the implementation of the referendum. And then inevitably there was a lot of rather unpleasant brinkmanship and squabbling right up to the last minute. That is now done. The basis of Britain's relationship with the rest of Europe is now set, although there are many elements, particularly what happens to our services industry and our very important financial services, what happens in the future. Added to that, our whole security apparatus, whether it's about chasing criminals or catching terrorists or cyber security, or working together with a small number of other European countries that have got powerful and capable armed forces like we have, which is primarily France, but there are one or two others. There's all sorts of reasons why we now need to find a way of working closely with our neighbours. Plus, there's tens of millions of Brits who, for reasons of work or pleasure or residency, need to be able to move around the European Union and want to do so on an easy basis, even if we can't go back to the totally seamless means of travelling around the European Union that we had before Brexit. But there's a lot of reasons why that should be done, and there's plenty of reasons why the heads of government themselves need to have stronger personal relationships so that they can address these issues together and work out what to do about China and Russia and trade policy and climate change and all those things which matter hugely to the populations of all our countries.
It might start by us recognising the EU ambassador as being an actual ambassador, perhaps?
I cannot understand the position that we seem to have taken on that. For all the 44 years that we were a member state, we were perfectly happy to agree that the EU representative was a diplomat and had the status of ambassador. So just because we've left the European Union seems to me is not a reason to go back on that and to be inconsistent with the principles of diplomacy that we have adopted all through this time. So I hope we will find a way around this.
Yeah, I should explain to listeners, if you listen back 2 episodes, you'll find the interview with João Valle de Almeida, who is the EU's kind of ambassador to this country, because he hasn't yet been given his papers to allow to be an ambassador. But I think Sir Peter there speaks for a lot of people maybe on that issue. So just going back into your book, they call it Diplomacy, 40 years of representing Britain abroad. It's available now in all good bookshops and will be linked in the show notes of this episode. In your time as a diplomat, where did you draw the line between diplomacy and politics?
Well, it's a great question. Of course, as a civil servant, which is what British diplomats are, we are bound to serve our country, our monarch, irrespective of who the government is. So we are apolitical in the work that we do. Of course, we can have our own political views and we vote for whoever we like in elections, but the job that we do is to serve whoever the government is in power. And so that means that whatever your personal views are, you get on with implementing the policies of that government to the best of your ability. There are occasions when you find that you just can't do it as a matter of principle. You become something of a conscientious objector, and then you can resign. Doesn't often happen, but 1 or 2 people I recall resigned over the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And 1 or 2 people have clearly found it was very difficult, being Remainers, to represent a United Kingdom which was busy implementing Brexit, and they moved aside or went on to do a different job. But I don't think that's about politics. That's about ensuring that you can do the job while still being loyal to yourself. And if there's a conflict of interest there, then you've just got to find a way around it. But I don't think we become political. The problem is that when you are representing the government, which the people of the United Kingdom have elected, you can sometimes sound like a politician. I recall coming back from the United States just after the Labour Party won the election in 1997, and some Labour ministerial friends of mine, and I was not an ambassador at the time, were saying to me, you ought to understand that we're being told by other members of the party that you're an out-and-out Thatcherite and we can't be trusted. And I wondered what that meant. And I thought back and I realized, well, I, of course, had been the councillor in charge of media affairs in Washington and also parliamentary relations. So my job had been to explain to congressmen what the government's position was, and certainly to explain to the US media and television and so on what the British government's policy was. Did that mean that I was a political beast? No, it didn't. But it did mean that my job was to represent the government that I was serving to the best of my ability. So it sometimes seemed like a civil servant had become a politician.
In your book, you talk about meeting Joe Biden, the current US president. You went to his parties, but you carefully draw a veil of what happened at his parties. Were they exciting?
Well, they were always fun, Christmas and other things. And he would come to my house as well quite a lot for different events. He came, for example, to sign the condolence book when Margaret Thatcher died and spent an hour with us, just, chatting, shooting the breeze and so on. And he and his wife, Dr. Jill Biden, were huge supporters of military veterans. So when Prince Harry, for example, came in connection with the Invictus Games, they would come to the house and meet our veterans who were visiting the embassy. And I would sometimes go and meet the man who is now the president, who was then the vice president, in his office in the White House to discuss aspects of foreign policy or countries that I knew a bit about, or the bilateral relationship. So there was all sorts of different reasons why a British ambassador would have good reason to talk to the vice president. And it so happens that's now somebody who is the new president of the United States. So it's nice to feel that there's somebody there who I got to know and to respect and admire hugely.
But you left just as diplomacy got fun. You stood down in January 2016, the year in which Brexit and Trump happened. I mean, Peter Westmacott, what kind of gift is that for your successors?
In a sense, the gift to a successor. I suppose it's a disappointment, not to be there during all that time. I left in January of 2016, and I can tell you that the last conversation I had with political experts as to who was going to be the Republican candidate in November that year and who was going to be the next president. Nobody thought it was going to be Trump, either as hardly anybody thought Trump would be the candidate. They were all talking about Senator Ted Cruz.
Yes.
And almost everybody thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win. So yes, you're right. I did hand my successor on the plate, a wonderfully interesting campaign to follow. And then, as you say, a few months later, we had Brexit. But it was, in one sense, a shame not to be around for such an important year for America and for Britain and for Europe. In another sense, my successor had a great time until he had to fall on his sword.
Well, yes, your successor, Sir Kim Darroch, did have to resign as ambassador to the UK after some of his thoughts were leaked about the US President Donald Trump at the time. Do you think that was an overreaction?
Well, I think it was a great shame that a series of telegrams, letters, whatever, that he'd sent to London were made public in that way. Clearly, he was disappointed that at that moment, the Foreign Secretary, as he then was, didn't support him to the hilt.
Boris Johnson.
But I think the real reason, it's not for me to speak for Kim, but I think the real reason why he felt, I think I better resign and leave 3 months before I'm due to leave, was that he got clear message from members of the Trump administration that they weren't going to deal with him. People were cancelling meetings because Trump had said that he was a pompous fool who didn't know what he was talking about. I think Kim felt, if I can't see the people who matter, I cannot serve my country and my government properly. So I think I better go and somebody else better take over.
And also in the book, you talk about why Trump tried to buy Greenland. and you sort of explained it in a way I hadn't thought of before.
Well, I don't know exactly why he did that, but it wasn't the first time that an American president had, offered to buy islands. They'd bought some in the Caribbean. They tried to buy Greenland before when its status was uncertain.
Harry Truman in 1946 for $100 million.
Exactly. And of course, America is what it is now because the Louisiana land purchase, as we call it, vast swathes of Southern and Central America bought from the French, Alaska, which was bought from the Russians. So they've done some pretty good real estate deals over the years in the United States of America. So it's not quite as crackers as some of us thought at the time.
Well, Sir Peter Westmacott, a fascinating chat. And the book's called They Call It Diplomacy, 40 Years of Representing Britain Abroad, available now from Head of Zeus, and we'll link to that in the show notes. Thank you for joining us today on Chopper's Politics. Thank you.
My pleasure, Chopper. Thanks a lot for having me.
Well, that's all for this week. Thank you to my guests, Arlene Foster, Theresa Villiers, and of course, Sir Peter Westmacott. Thank you to my producers, Louisa Wells, Edith Lampitt, and Theo Loulidis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. Thank you to you all for getting in touch with your suggestions for ways to refer to a possible Scottish exit from the Union. Two of my favourites were Squit, thank you to Craig for that one, and Scotch Exit from Sean. Very good. And on that note, if you have any ideas about what EU regulations we should be scrapping, please email us, chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, and if they're short and pithy, I'll make sure they're read out next week. If you're not already a Telegraph subscriber, go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper, where you can get your first month's subscription completely free of charge, and after that you pay just £2 a week. Terrific value, and we couldn't make podcasts like this one without the support of our subscribers. If you enjoyed this show, please do leave us a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps other people find Chopper's Politics. And of course, if you can, please buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph. You won't regret it. Until next time though, cheerio!